I would like to introduce today's speakers. We have Chris Best and Carolyn Whiting, and they have been working out in Big Bend and documenting the populations of some rare Big Bend plant species. And their process for doing this has been rather innovative, and they have succeeded in finding and counting populations and actually finding better numbers of some plants than we knew existed.
Okay, well, our presentation tonight is on estimating plant population sizes of federally listed plants at Big Bend National Park. And I have to say, it's a pleasure to come back to Native Plant Society, and I've discovered there's a great advantage to giving these presentations via Zoom, because you can't accidentally leave your PowerPoint in the office.
But you have to
and I
deal
say
with
that
me.
with some pain. Anyway, you'll notice Carolyn has two titles. When this project began, she was a graduate student with the illustrious Dr. Norma Fowler, who is present tonight, and is still a graduate student, but due to her excellent work as the lead for this project, she was selected as the full-time botanist at Big Bend National Park. So a round of applause, and it's good news for all of us in plant conservation.
Yay.
Well, I think
that's wonderful.
First thing is to introduce our honored guests tonight. First, I'll talk about the Chisols hedgehog cactus. Some people call it Chisols mountain hedgehog cactus. Joe Sirotnik thought that since it's not actually in the Chisols mountains, but you can see them in the background, that Chisols hedgehog was more appropriate, and I agree with that. The entire global population is within Big Bend National Park and is encompassed by that red oval you see in the lower left in the map. There's another subspecies, Phobianus, that has been found in Coahuila and Durango. We listed it as a threatened species in September of 1988. So what is a threatened species? Well, let's go to the source, the Endangered Species Act. Section 3 has all the definitions, and these have very specific legal implications that end up in federal courts all the time. So an endangered species is a species that's in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And I say ... because they exclude all kinds of pest species that we might want to wipe out with insecticides. So they're not considered, but I mean, we can go ahead and extinct them. And the term threatened species is a species which is likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future. So there is a distinction. For plants, the difference really makes essentially there's really no difference in protection. But anyway, continuing on, we have bunched Cory cactus, Coryphantha ramelosa, subspecies ramelosa. There is another subspecies, Santuarosa, in the state of Coahuila. This species ranges from right near the southernmost tip of the Big Bend in southern Brewster County into southeastern Terrell County. It was listed as threatened on November 6, 1979, along with a whole lot of other plants, which I'll explain. In the lower left, you can see the very crumbly, flaky, upturned strata of limestone that this species seems to prefer. Sclerocactus mariposensis, Lloyds, Mariposa cactus, was named for the Mariposa mine. I think it was a cinnabar mine near Terlingua. It has also been called Echinomastus mariposensis. The global range extends from southeastern Presidio County into southeastern Brewster County, as well as Coahuila, but some recent phylogenetic research indicated that may be a different subspecies. It was also listed in 1979. And finally, we're going to talk about Guadalupe Fescue, Festuca ligulata. That's one that I worked on the species status assessment, and this was listed in September of 2017. It had the interesting distinction of being the very first species listed as endangered under the prior presidential administration, but nothing bad happened to me. This Guadalupe Fescue, if you look at the photograph number 2, the red arrow is pointing to the rather long, clear ligule, which is an identification feature of that grass. And you can see the typical habitat up in Boot Canyon. And in photograph 5, you can see the former park botanist, Joe Sirotnik. I had the pleasure of working with Joe and volunteers on a number of the plot monitorings that we're going to discuss. And I forgot to mention that we've divided this presentation into 2 parts. So my part is really to explain, why are we doing this? Why do we want to measure plant population sizes? And then Carolyn will tell us how it's being done. Well, how did we, by what means do we classify species as threatened or endangered? How do we determine that they need to be protected under the Endangered Species Act? Well, in the Act itself, Section 12 is a special section for endangered plants, and it says the Smithsonian Institution will come up with a list. And so they did this, and the Smithsonian list became candidates for plants to be listed. And the very first batch of plants was listed in November of 1979, and there were quite a few in that batch. And then they kind of worked on that list over the years, and subsequently, new species become petitioned or we add them on our own. This process for classifying species as threatened or endangered is now a very formal procedure called a species status assessment. And the species status assessment derives a species viability, meaning its ability to survive through time, is based on the 3 R's of resilience, which is the population size and demographic trends necessary for each population and the species itself to survive. You need enough numbers, right? Redundancy is the number of populations, because we may lose some populations, but if we have enough, the species can recover. Representation refers to the range of environmental and genetic diversity that a species needs to survive. So population sizes and population numbers, 2 of the 3 R's, both require that we can, first of all, identify a population and delineate it, which is a whole topic on its own. And we have to be able to determine how large those populations are. Well, how do we learn about rare plants? Well, that Smithsonian list was based off of herbarium records. So all they did is just looked at all the records of plants that had ever been described from the United States, and they picked out the ones that didn't have very many collections. Well, that's a starting point, right? Now, if you wanted to learn more, you would look at the places plants have been found, and you go to those places and see if you can find some more. So we have these, what I call wander surveys. Some people call them meander surveys. There's other terms that are used, but these can be intuitive, or they can be informed. And the intuitive survey, and I've known some outstanding plant surveyors. Bill Carr, you all know, is one. Tom Patterson, Jackie Poole. These people, they're like, I always thought they were in league with the devil or something. I mean, I couldn't, you know, they would just arrive at a place, go, wait, stop here. All right, I want to look. And they'd wander around, and a couple of minutes later, they'd find this incredible rare plant that nobody else had seen. So, and sometimes I don't think they can even tell you what guides them. They just know. And that's a unique talent, but it isn't very transferable. But anyway, that's a great first step to finding more populations of a plant, getting some intuition about where it lives, what's it associated with. That will lead to an informed wander survey where we're building this knowledge base, and we're thinking, okay, this thing lives on caliche. We find it on slopes or not. It's, you know, at a certain elevation range, and you start saying, hey, I know where there's some more of that. And now we have geographic information systems where we can actually plot these data. We can overlay all these data layers and find places that have the sweet spot, that have all the right characteristics that we know about, and use that to focus our searches. And that's a logical step, but it does have a problem in that that type of survey is biased towards the habitats that we already know support the species, and they may miss the populations that occur in different habitat types. And it happens again and again. And another problem is that quite often where we find rare plants today may not be their optimal habitats. A lot of times the rare plants end up in these suboptimal habitats where they're just surviving because they've been extirpated from their optimal habitats. Now, a next step that has been taken for many rare plant studies is when you happen to know where there's a cluster of this plant of interest, you put a plot down on top of it. And you put a center stake in there, and every plant that you can find, you put a tag by it, a numbered tag. And Joe Sorodnik, Carolyn's predecessor in the job, because he was on a national park and he didn't want to draw attention to these, some of these cactuses are, you know, they're threatened by illicit collection. And he actually had rocks, and he knew them by name. He would just go, I would find a plant, and he would go, let me look. And he would go, okay, you see that rock to the left? No, not that, the other one right there, turn it over. And I would turn over, and it would have a number written on it. And you go, yeah, I found that one 2 years ago. But in any case, all of these individuals are numbered, and you go out year after year, and you collect data on their size, reproduction, mortality, any new plants equal recruitment. And now what often happens with this type of plot is people don't quite know what to do when you find plants outside the plot. So usually they would establish a new plot. So we're looking here at, on the left is one of the permanent plots that was originally established by Anderson and Schmalzell in 1997. Jeanette Jurado collected data there and the Park Service. And on the right, you see one of the Chisols hedgehog plots. And there again is Joe Sorodnik with Jeanette Jurado. And I want to take a moment here. Many of you probably knew Joe Sorodnik. He left the park in 2016, and sadly he passed away in 2019. So we always remember him when we work at Big Bend, and all the great work that he helped get started there. In any case, what we found with all the, and I worked with Joe on Guadalupe Fescue plots several times, and went out in 2016 and we looked at the Lloyds Mariposa and the Chisols Hedgehog plots. All of the plot data showed that the populations inside the plots had declined. And Joe asked me, what do you think this means? Should all these threatened species be reclassified as endangered? What's going on here? Now, I wish I could ask him, because I think he knew the answer and he was asking a leading question. And the answer that I gave is, I don't have any idea what this means, because although this type of plot has gained lots of interesting data about plants, about their growth rates and reproduction, it doesn't tell us anything about the population sizes, because the plots they don't actually represent the populations themselves. So Carolyn is going to focus a bit more on the plots we established for Guadalupe Fescue. And I think it's just a fascinating story. And here you can see the population and area in Boot Canyon up in the Chisols Mountains. On the left, you can see a purple rectangle where the entire known population at that time existed. And the first plots were established there by Jackie Poole in 1993. And she and many others collected data there every year. And Joe Sorodnik picked up the work. I think he arrived in about 2000. And like I said, I got to work with him several times. There you see the fescue on the left. And that rectangle on the right is a 5 hectare, like 12 acre area. And you can see these 6 plots. Actually, there's 7, right? But for a while they had lost plot 5, so they established a new one and then they found it again. So anyway, but there's actually 6 plots. And they collected data for, I think, 23 years. And when I worked on the species status assessment, I asked Norma to help me analyze the data. And Norma extracted, I think, every bit of useful information out of that data set that can be extracted. Now, an interesting thing, and there you see Joe with his volunteers again, is, okay, so we started with 127 individuals in 1994, and by 2013, 2014, there were only 47 left. And, you know, when you have 47 left of a species in the world, that's grim news. I mean, it's like, we call it epi or quasi-extinct, because even though there's still some individuals, there's just not enough left to survive. But Joe said, you know, over the years, I keep seeing more and more fescues that are off the plots. How many? I don't know. You know, haven't been able to count them, but we know they're out there. And so in 2017, while park personnel were counting plants in the plots, I did an informed wander survey, and I found 225 additional plants outside the plots. So we had a total of 339. Well, that's a whole lot better than 47 or whatever it was. In any case, when Joe and I discussed this in 2016, we kind of jointly hatched the idea to go to Texas Parks and Wildlife and ask them to make a priority to fund a study that would look at the population sizes of all these 4 plants. And the money actually comes from my agency. It's called Section 6. And these are grants that we give to the states. And TPWD is, they work very closely with us on that. And Section 6 has funded a lot of great work for plant conservation in Texas. More animal stuff, I know, but at least we get some funding. And so this is the point where I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn. So thank you for your attention up to now. And Carolyn, take it over.
I see there's some questions. Maybe I'll answer your question. So
yes.
Keep going. Is that full screen for you? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So to pick up where Chris left off, Norma and Martin Terry applied for that Section 6 funding and got the money, and then said, okay, Carolyn, here's the money, here's the project, and I got to work. So I'm going to walk you through what the process is we've been using to estimate the population sizes. I'm going to go through it in detail for the fescue, and then I think you'll get the sense of how it works, and then I'll kind of give you a summary for how it worked out for the cacti. So the fescue, like Chris said, has this large ligule. It's a small bunch grass. It lives in the high elevations in the Chisols. And there's its habitat, this oak conifer mixed woodland. And you can see some oaks in there. There's a juniper on the right, and enough light comes through the canopy to support some sparse grasses, including the fescue. So the first step in this process, estimating the population size, is to define the sampling universe. And this is mostly using habitat preferences that the species has. So you're just focusing on the places that are habitat for the species, but we also take into account some practical considerations because we can't always look everywhere that all the habitat is. So in this case, we're just focusing in Big Bend National Park. The species also occurs in Mexico, but we don't have access to there, and this project's just about the park. So if we limit our area to Big Bend National Park, and then we further limit our area to the elevations over 1,800 meters, which is a habitat preference. And we also decided to remove areas where the slope is greater than 30 degrees because we did not want to bring rock climbing gear with us on this project. So it's a safety concern. And I zoom into this area, and there's those original plants that we knew about from Joe and Jackie's work in pink there. And we further limited our search area using this coarse vegetation mapping, which showed that there's some oak woodland, which is not the oak conifer woodland. It's shown there in blue. It's actually a stream, if you want to call it that. It doesn't usually have water in it, but it's in blue there. So we cut that out because we know that's also not habitat. And so then if we just focus in on this continuous polygon that contains the known plants, this area in red is our sampling universe, and we're going to sample it. We're going to survey this area completely in an even way, which prior modeling by Norma showed that this is statistically valid way to, an unbiased way to get an estimation of the population size. So I used ArcGIS to generate these plot centers shown in black here. They're 70 meters apart from each other. And the procedure is we hike up there, we go to these plot centers, and then we count all of the fescue within a 15-meter radius of that center point. So it's a circle with a 15-meter radius. We also had a few predefined characteristics for the field that we would not survey a plot. For example, if it was on a rock slide, or in one case, we had a boulder that was literally the size of the whole plot, we said, okay, this is not habitat. So we had these predefined criteria where if we got to the plot and we found that on the small scale, things that we couldn't pick up from GIS would discount it as habitat, we would skip that plot. So this is what we did in October 2019. We went up and surveyed these plots, and what's shown in gray is the plots that we collected data from. We had to skip a few plots because of those predefined criteria, like I mentioned. And we found we found plants in 7 of our plots. If we look at where the previous known plants were in pink, you can see that 5 of those plots were kind of in the general area of where the plants were known to occur, but 2 of them were hundreds of meters away from where we knew the plants to occur and where that black arrow is pointing to. And there's Chris counting those plants in that last plot. It was very exciting because it was the last day. We were tired and we're like, you know, we should really try to go pick up those last plots. So we packed up all our gear and then we hit the jackpot with finding these plants out there. So it was really exciting. So then the math is very simple from that data we collected to get a population size estimate. We take the number of plants we found in our plots, we divide it by the area we surveyed, so just the sum of all those 15-meter plots. That gives us a plant density. Then we multiply that density by the larger polygon area, and that gives us the number of plants in that larger polygon, the sampling universe. So for the fescue, we found 267 plants in our plots. We surveyed 3.39 hectares, which gave us a density of 79 plants per hectare. And that means that we estimate the population to be 1,787 plants in that sampling universe. For the cacti, this is kind of this is where we would stop the project. But the fescue had a turn in it, I guess you could say, an update, because shortly after that area experienced a wildfire in April, almost a year ago, April 2021. So you can see the boot on the left side in 2019 and some of the smoke that was in the area in 2021. So I should mention also that this area, probably that boot cabin area, probably hadn't experienced a fire, I think some 80 years ago when the last fire in that area was. And some studies have suggested that fires probably should be occurring maybe every 25 years. So the area was long overdue for a fire. And you probably noticed all that dead fuel when that habitat picture that I showed you. So fire suppression may be a factor in why the fescue was not doing well. It might be that it needed things to be opened up by a fire. And there's some other evidence to suggest that the fescue likes fire. The places where it's been found in Mexico recently have all experienced fire recently. So when this fire happened, I think they called Chris, right? And they said, what should we do? Should we let the fescue area burn or should we stop it? Right, Chris?
Yes. Yeah, they called me not long after it started. I mean, by the time they knew about it. And we talked frequently over the first, 4 hours or so, got a lot of different opinions and talked about strategies. Now, could they have even stopped it? I mean, you and I both know just to hike up there, carrying nothing more than a water bottle is a piece of hard work. It takes 3 hours just to get to Boot Spring and you're worn out when you get there. So then imagine getting up there with any kind of gear with you. There's very little water available except for some rainwater collection. How do you fight a fire? How would you stop it? We felt that given the cool conditions in April and the fact that there had been some rain prior to that, not too long before, that we know it's got to burn sooner or later. And if it burns in July, it's just going to reduce the entire thing to char. So the decision was made to let it burn through the whole fescue area. Because it's an inevitable thing anyway. So it was like the best case scenario. And that's what they did.
It was best case scenario. So Chris and I went back in June, like as soon as they let people back into that area after the fires ended, Chris and I hurried over there and revisited those same plots to assess the fire severity, see how intense the fire was. And so this is a pretty typical picture of what the area looks like. Low severity. You can see that the fire didn't get into the canopies for the most part in the Boot Springs area, in the fescue area. We see green leaves. Some of the lower leaves, they might have experienced high temperatures, so the leaves themselves died, but they weren't consumed by the flames. You can see some of the litter on the ground is probably from the dead leaves, probably pretty fresh from the dead leaves that were killed from the high temperatures. But then underneath, there's litter that wasn't consumed. So even on the ground level, it wasn't particularly severe. And we can even see in this picture grasses. It's hard to tell. Maybe they were spared by the fire. Maybe they burned and they're already resprouting. Oops, I'm gonna go the other way. Here's an area that was a little bit more severe. But so you can see there's some dead agaves, but even the grasses are starting to resprout. And these aren't fescue, but just giving you a sense of, you know, even in some of the like more severe areas, it wasn't that bad. So this is what we found for the fire severity, revisiting those same plots. Just looking at the ground level, the substrate area, most of the plots were either unburned or low severity, so it was very light fire. And there were some patches where the fire got more intense, medium or high on the substrate level. But if we just sort of ignore all the plots that didn't have the fescue in 2019 and just focus on the plots that had the fescue, you can see one of them was unburned, 4 of them were low severity, and 2 of them were medium severity. So, I mean, like Chris said, this is best case scenario. We've got pre-fire data from a scientific perspective, we've got pre-fire data, which is great. And then from a conservation perspective, it wasn't earth scorching type of fire that could possibly happen when you have that long since the last fire and all that fuel buildup. So we were really surprised when we went out again in October, just a few months ago, and we found 2 of the plots in the northeast with the red cross didn't have any fescue in them at all. And then the 5 plots that we did find fescue in had fewer fescue than they did in 2019. And overall, compared to 2019, when we found 267 plants in our plots, we only found 112 in October most recently. And that comes out to 58% of the population lost since 2019, most likely because of the fire. And we have other researchers who are also studying the fescue up there, and they, using a completely different method, came up with a 50% mortality rate. So the numbers are consistent across these 2 completely different methods of estimating population size. So what does this mean? This is not what we wanted or expected, but the thing is, I think it's too early to really make a call one way or the other about how this population is going to respond. We know so little about the biology of the species. We don't know when the seeds germinate. We don't know anything about the seed longevity in the soil, whether it has a good soil seed bank or not. So maybe that October survey was too soon. Maybe it just needs a bit more time and some seeds are going to germinate now that the canopy is more open and some of the litter's been removed. Or maybe we're at a real turning point for the population and they're not going to be able to spring back from this. Another complicating factor is that this year it's been really dry. We have hardly any spring flowers this year. It would have been really nice if the weather had cooperated and gave us some rain after the fire, but it didn't. So what we're doing is we're going to revisit these plots again next year. And we're also preparing ourselves to take heavy-handed action in the sense of growing plants from our seed library and planting them out there, or considering that as an option at least. You know, we're preparing for all scenarios basically at this point, and it's something we're actively discussing and making decisions on. The other goal for this project is to eventually, after we stop worrying about this fire and returning to these plots, we'd like to broaden our search and look for more plants in other areas where we suspect there's habitat, using that same method of evenly spaced plots. So that's the fescue. It's the most complicated story because it had that twist at the end with the fire. But for our cacti, we have a bit more straightforward, where the goal was to estimate population sizes, and that's what we've been doing. Here's our bunched Cory cactus, the one that likes that limestone and has a pink flower. same process of using important habitat features. In this case, geology was really important to define that sampling universe ahead of time. And then when we got into the field, we discounted fairly large areas of our transects. And I should mention, in this case, we're using transects instead of plots, but it's the same idea that they're evenly spaced. So you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in the middle of the sampling universe, those transects have big breaks in them. That's because it's actually a arroyo, a drainage that's full of mesquite and acacia, and it's the wrong habitat. It's also a total pain to walk through. And so when we got to those areas, we said this is no longer habitat, and we discounted it from our sampling area. So using that same math of calculating the density and then applying it to the whole sampling universe, we came up with a population size of 1,766 plants in that polygon. And that's some of its habitat there down by the river. The Chisols hedgehog cactus, probably our most photogenic species, or one of them at least, in this project. As Chris mentioned, this one only occurs in Big Bend National Park. It's not found anywhere else. And we walked about 70 kilometers worth of transects for this species. We covered a huge area and we found a lot of plants. So the math comes out to be 153 plants were in our transects. We surveyed 116 hectares of land, which is a huge amount. And that came out to a density of 1.3 plants per hectare. And I'm still working on some of the math here. It's complicated because this is such a large area, but a very conservative estimate would be that there's 4,697 plants in its sampling universe. But still working, I think that we could probably apply that density to a larger area. So we're working on updating that. And then Lloyds Mariposa. So Chris didn't mention, but he was here last week and we were surveying it and we didn't finish. We finished on Friday. So I actually don't have a population size estimate for you. If you could believe I didn't have time to do all that in 3 days since we finished the field work. But here's some cute pictures of the cactus. And here's estimate of its potential habitat. Of all of our species, this one's probably the most common. The Cory Phanthos also has a wide range, but you can see there's a lot of habitat in the park, and then the habitat extends on both to the east and the west of the park and down into Mexico, although Chris was saying there might be some subspecies discussion. So Chris and I walked all along that band, that really thick north to south band on the east side of the park. That if you're familiar with the park, that's along Old Ore Road. And then on Friday, we went to Mesa de Anguila, which is that very western corner of the park, and we found a bunch of plants out there. So we found, I don't know, on our transects, 100 plus plants altogether. So I think we're going to get a really good estimate from that, but I don't have the numbers for you right now. So some conclusions. This method, because it's evenly spaced and it's everything is, the sampling universe is defined ahead of time, it's repeatable, and it can be used, it can be modified so that you can turn it into a monitoring program. And that's the goal for all 4 of these species, is to monitor them over time and use these same sorts of methods to watch out for population size changes like we did with the fescue. We've already already started that with the fescue. The sampling universe, because all these habitat requirements and then practical restrictions are defined ahead of time, you can easily take this project and adjust it if new habitat is discovered, or say you wanted to go and take this method and apply it to a different park or a different property. You could just take these same methods and use them there. And it doesn't require, someone who has that sixth sense about where the species might be. It's all black and white like that. So like I mentioned, for the fescue especially, we're going to be expanding our habitat search into more habitat, looking for more plant clusters. We're going to be modifying these methods to turn them into a regular monitoring program. And we're going to use these data to reassess the conservation needs for these species. So in the case of the fescue, maybe there's a threshold where we need to start doing something heavy-handed, or maybe for the Mariposa census, we find enough plants and there's enough habitat and it's doing well, and maybe we need to consider delisting it. I don't know. We have this data would be used in part of that to answer that question. As you can imagine, with all this field work, there's been so many people who've helped, and I'm so grateful. Besides, of course, Norma, and I should also mention that Martin Terry was also applicant for that Section 6 grant, helped secure the funding, and Chris and Joe Sorotnik. But many people have come into the field, some people just for a day, some people are have it scared away completely, like Whitney Bear and Deb Manley here in the park. And I'd like to thank the Fowler Lab, especially Norma, and also Olivia, who did her master's project on these 4 species, and everyone else who's been supportive in one way or another. Big Bend National Park and Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, especially Anna Strong. And then, as Chris mentioned, this funding came from the Texas Parks and Wildlife and also from UT, Department of Biology. So, and then I leave this picture, this lovely picture from Joe and Jeanette.
Kind of a take-home message in that, you know, when I started working on rare plants in 1990, there was sort of a prevailing idea that because we only find these rare plants, you know, in very, very discrete areas, you know, you can walk through mile after mile of what looks like the same habitat, and suddenly you find this cluster of this species that you're looking for. And the conclusion was always, there must be something incredibly unique about this spot. We don't know what it is, we can't see it, but it's like, you know, angels in heaven had stone tablets that prescribe the geographic coordinates where this plant has to live, and it's got to be right here. And of course, that's always bad news because, you know, an oil well goes up or a highway gets built or a pipeline comes through and it wipes those precious little spots out. And, you know, these permanent plots that were not representative of populations, in every case that I know, not just the plants we mentioned here, but many other species, the plot data always, the populations inevitably decline in those plots. And yet, when you talk to the people that do the work, they usually find additional plants outside the plots. And that's what we found, of course, with the fescue, and we've found it with towbush fishhook cactus and other species. And finally, so when we do a study like this and we see what's really happening is that maybe those little spots really aren't that unique. The populations move over time. And how fast they move has a lot to do with the life history of a plant. Annual plants, they kind of bounce around quite a bit. Whereas if you were looking at something like Hinckley's oak that may live for hundreds of years, you know, it would take many human lifespans to see that. But certainly with these species, I think what we're looking at is that, you know, plants, they'll do real well in a particular area, maybe for 20 years or so, and then they start to die out. But by that time, they've spread seeds that have dispersed around and new colonies start appearing elsewhere.
I'll ask the questions and we can have a crack. So first, Alice asked, what caused Guadalupe Fescue's decline? So why did it get listed?
Well, yeah, I can answer that because I did the species status assessment. Because we were down to 2 known populations, the population sizes, especially after the drought of, you know, the mid 2000s and 2011, populations that we had, you know, the numbers that we had showed a pretty bad decline. And, you know, the threats were the degradation of the habitat due to a lack of fire, So that's why it was listed. But in addition, it's very likely that a species like the fescue is a Pleistocene relict. It may have been much more abundant, 11,000 years ago. And as the climate warmed, the populations went up the mountains to higher elevations. And what happens when a population goes upslope is the area that it can occupy diminishes, right? Until you reach a point at the top. And if your optimal habitat goes higher, then that mountain is tall, you're out of luck. Now you have zero potential habitat, right? So it looks like that's what has happened with the fescue. We are really excited though that, when I started working on this species in 2008 or 2009, I did a herbarium search and found that there were records of this species from 1941 in southern Coahuila at a place called El Fraile, and it's pretty remote. And so I said, hey, look at this. A lot of people said, yeah, I don't know, that's too far away. But when you look at it, if it does occur there, and you look at the amount of high elevation pine oak forest in northern Coahuila and Chihuahua and Zacatecas, Durango, there's a lot of potential habitat. So we actually got a high resolution scan of that specimen. And sure enough, Jesus Valdez Reina, probably the leading agrostologist for that species, he said, you know what, that is Guadalupe Fescue. And they had looked for it previously because he's based in Saltillo, and they didn't find it, but this summer they did find a population in that area. So that means, the type collection was Guadalupe Mountains National Park, hasn't been seen there since 1953. Then you've got Big Bend, and then right across the river and the Maderas del Carmen Natural Protected Area, you have 2-3 populations now. Now, a couple of 100 kilometers south in southern Coahuila, you've got plants. So that means there's a whole lot of turf in between that really nobody's looked at. Too remote and a little scary with the cartels. But so that's all good news for this species. But it's, no matter how you cut and slice it, this is an extremely rare plant. And I think that the classification as endangered is appropriate.
Do these population sizes vary by species, region, type, or habitat, or are they uniform? And I think this is maybe referring to the 3 R's that you were saying. Are populations defined the same for all the species, or are they kind of tailored to the species and the habitat?
But for the criterion of resilience, we have this concept called the minimum viable population. Well, you could spend, $1 million in 20 years of study to try to determine what that minimum viable population size. Well, if we had that kind of money, we would probably spend it on other things, and we don't have 20 years to spend anyway. We need an answer today. So fortunately, there's this table that was prepared by a guy named Bruce Pavlik in 1996, and we've kind of adapted it, and it just estimates what the MVP ought to be based on 9 life history characteristics. And we've used this table over and over again, and even the harshest of critics, including at least one person who's present today, hasn't attacked us for this, and so we keep doing it. Not to mention any names, Norma, but no, we like to run things by Norma, because if there's anything wrong with it, we will hear about it. But it's a very practical approach, and the interesting thing is, you give me a cactus, an annual herbaceous plant, you give me a grass, an oak tree. Almost every time you run this, the numbers are going to come out between 1,000 and 2,000. maybe sometimes a little bit below, maybe 900, maybe 2,200, but a lot of them come out right in the middle, 14, 1,500. And, you know, and it's because, you know, the basic, you know, species may be different, but certain things are going to be pretty much the same from one species to another.
Next question was, do technologies like LiDAR assist in locating similar habitat? I didn't use LiDAR for this project in particular, but it absolutely could be a tool to help identify habitat, especially. Yeah, it could be used. I'll leave it at that.
Well, also, I mean, you used elevation ranges,
Yeah.
right? So
yeah, so I used EM instead,
LiDAR
but
because I think
yeah.
LiDAR is used to create what are called digital elevation models. And so, you know, they'll use I think it's a LiDAR scan of the Earth's surface from a satellite or maybe an airplane, but it look at 10-meter pixel sizes. And now this is what I don't know is, does it average the elevation over that whole thing or just take a point right in the middle? I've never known that. But then you can derive slope from that because the software will look at the elevation of this pixel and the one next to it. And if they're different, it calculates a slope. But what you have to use that with caution because, you know, I'm working on big red sage now, and it occurs like in these narrow ravines that you could have a ravine like this, and the plant, you know, here's one pixel on this side, here's the other pixel, and it says there's no slope when it could be like that, right? Or you could have two pixels next to each other, and it says, oh, look, that's a really steep slope, but the plant actually might occur on a level terrace that's next to a bluff, and then more of them on top of a bluff. So, but anyway, that's, I think if you use DEMs, Carolyn, then I think you used LiDAR.
Next question was, should Guadalupe Fescue be cultivated in nurseries and ultimately be reintroduced into Big Bend? This is an active discussion, and it's an option that we're considering. I'm going to punt on that one because it's kind of controversial because, well, yeah. And it's also difficult. It's not just as simple as growing some plants, putting them on your back or putting them on the mules, hiking the 3+ hours up there. It also means you're going back up on a regular basis to water them. So it's not, even if it wasn't kind of pros and cons from a scientific perspective, from a logistics perspective, it's not simple either. But it is something we're considering, especially if the population is not going to rebound on its own. One possibility.
I did include propagation and reintroduction as a tool. It's officially a recovery action in the recovery plan. So, you know, I wanted to make sure that I included that so that it can be used. It doesn't mean that we have to do that, but it means we have that tool at our discretion. But Carolyn is right. You want to consider this real carefully because what can happen when we propagate plants, if you don't collect seeds from enough source individuals, let's say you're not paying attention and most of your seeds just came from 3 individuals that were doing real well that year, you know, and then you end up producing of this population that is, we call it swamping the gene pool. You know, almost all the individuals descend from very few. Now, we don't know yet what the breeding system of Guadalupe Fescue is. And if it's an obligate outcrosser and you flood a population with the progeny of very few source plants, that's bad, because then you get very little reproduction after that. Plants flower and they make seed, but all their neighbors are too closely related to them. So that's one example of how, you know, and that actually happened with a species, I think it's the Hawaiian silver sword, you know, best of intentions, total backfire.
Next question is about fire retardant. The fire retardant that's used in these fires, does it pollute or harm the recovery of plants afterwards? The fire retardant, I don't think is as bad as another method that they use to stop fires, which is to bulldoze a line that would, a black line basically. So it removes all the fuel from an area so that when the fire hits that line, you know, the fire stops. That's really destructive because it's using heavy machinery and removing plants. I don't know anything about the fire retardant and its persistence in the environment.
Now, I don't believe they used fire retardant on the.
They did actually, because I went up and I saw some still there the other day. Yeah. Just a little bit of remnant color left on some of the trees.
Okay.
On the South Rim, especially. I don't think in the fescue area.
Yeah.
Next question, were the high burn severity patches on steep slopes? No, not always. A lot of the steep slopes are very rocky, so they didn't have a lot of fuel. But do you remember, Chris, that one patch of where the fire got into the canopies of the trees and it was just like these stumps that were left? That was on a pretty flat area on that Kalima Trail. So no, it wasn't driven by slope so much, at least in the fescue area. Probably in other parts on a broader scale played a part. Why 58% population loss in your opinion? I think it's plant mortality is the answer. Not hiding plants or whatever, but at least of the mature plants. We don't know what's going on with the seed bank. What steps taken to ensure survival? I don't think we're taking any steps for the remaining plants, but we are monitoring the population to see if it rebounds on its own. I'm not sure what we could do. We could water them maybe.
It brings up a great point though, because if you approach plant conservation like the medical profession where, you know, you do no harm, right? You could say, hey, why did you let that habitat burn? You lost, you know, more than half the population. You did harm there. But if we don't let that habitat burn, then the species will gradually decline until it's totally gone. But there's no guilt involved. We're like, oh, you know, we just let it happen. But actually, when you think about it, if someone has cancer, you know, and I've just in the last couple of weeks, 2 of my friends are undergoing treatments for the same cancer. It's really weird, but fortunately, everything looks good for them. But if they had done nothing, then, you know, in a few years, it would have gone metastatic and they both, their days would be numbered, right? But they both elected to have treatments that aren't fun and do result in some damage, but it will give them a much better chance at life. So it's a little bit like, you know, getting surgery or chemotherapy or radiation for cancer. It's like this habitat has to burn or it will completely change and then your rare species are gone, right? And what we really need to see with the fescue is how much seed comes up from the soil seed bank. We really haven't had an opportunity yet to know because we're in a dry La Nina cycle here. But there was an earlier attempt, I think in the 90s, to assess the soil seed bank. And they took a bunch of samples and they didn't find any seeds. So that's pretty grim news. It's like this species doesn't form a seed reserve. But we just found out that seeds that were collected in the mid-90s from Boot Canyon were kept in storage at Desert Botanical Garden, and they have attempted to germinate those, and they're getting like 80 and 90% germination from seeds that are how old, Carolyn? Like
30. Yeah.
30 years old. Now, granted, they were stored under good conditions, but that's very, very encouraging. And also, if it turns out that that fire really did permanently knock down the population of Big Bend, we have seeds collected from the very same population that are growing right now at Desert Botanical Garden. And they could either be, shipped out here and replanted in the fall after a rain so that you don't have to keep going and watering, or they could be used to generate seeds. They could just be held in a plot and generate seeds, keeping track of maternal lines and all of that stuff. And then those, without ever collecting additional seed from the wild population, you could generate tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of seeds that could be used to restore that population. If Carolyn will allow it. She has a lot of service rules to follow.
Yeah, we do have a lot of rules. It sounds like the situation with the fescue could change quite suddenly given the small population range. Is the outcome iffy? Absolutely. I really don't know what's going to happen. I don't have a gut feeling on it. And the data, I mean, it's supposed to like fire. That's what we found with the populations in Mexico, but obviously losing half the population is concerning. So it's something I work on a weekly basis, basically, to come up with how we're going to deal with this. Next question. Have you seen any evidence of poaching on your species? Chris, do you want to answer that?
No.
No?
No.
No, you don't want to answer, or no poaching?
I think that historically there has been evidence of cactus poaching of these species at Big Bend. And those were among the principal threats that justified listing these for protection. And I'm trying to think if I remember if, see, at that point, I don't know, it's hard to, unless you catch somebody with a bag full of cactuses, then the evidence might be, well, we did this transect 5 years ago, and now there aren't a bunch of plants, but we do have a lot of holes in the ground. I mean, but even that is like, well, it could have been, well, I don't know. You don't have armadillos there.
Rabbits. We got abundance of rabbits.
I worked for many years at Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge down in the valley. And some of our refuge tracks had peyote on them. And I remember there was one particular set of caliche outcrops that had several thousand peyote. And then the next time I went out there, there were several thousand holes. So we know that one was poached. And the peyote pickers will take it all. And they do, they're supposed to cut it at ground level. They don't bother. They just dig it up.
Next comment was that maybe the plants don't tolerate high density, and we kind of suspected that Friday when we went to that Mariposa census site. And the last transect we did had so many cacti on it, and it felt like the transect was never going to end. We couldn't even step 2 feet without finding another bunch, which is great. But then we were also finding a lot of dead cacti. And Chris, you made a comment that you thought maybe there's some negative density dependence with the beetles. That's like a nice spot for cacti.
Yeah, the cactus longhorn beetle it's not much of a specialist, and it'll pick a variety of cactuses that are about that size. And what I found were hollowed out stems that had an exit hole. So that may be the longhorn beetle. Some cactuses have very specific parasites, like the Tobush fishhook cactus has a weevil that, it's flightless. So it doesn't disperse very far, but once it gets to a towbush population, you know, they have a party and they reproduce like crazy until basically all the adult plants are gone.
Next question was, do you take corresponding habitat measurements in the plots, slope, direction, angle of slope, etc.? And yes, and we are doing a little bit of analysis on that, but it's for the traits that we use to define the sampling universe, there's not much variation on some of those. So for example, if I only look on Boquillas limestone for a cactus, well, I can't really analyze geology, which geology features the cactus grows on, because that was part of what I limited the study to in the first place. So some of the things that we used in the study design don't make for interesting variables to analyze after the fact, because it was already limited by those things, if that makes sense. But some of them we are in this another step in this project. Why do we care about Guadalupe Fescue?
I'll try, and then Norma can give a better one. But, you know, I was thinking about this just today, because we always struggle with this. We're always asked this questions, and we're kind of like, our jaw drops, like, because, you know, it's part of our natural heritage, you know, and it's like, you either get it or you don't. But I was thinking, you know, what if you got into your time machine and you went back and you met a bunch of Neanderthals like 40,000 years ago, and you gave each one, you know, a state-of-the-art iPhone or something. And the Neanderthals are like, this is a weird thing. Look, when you break it open, it's got all this shiny stuff inside. Wow, that is so cool. Here, why don't you're my friend, you know, I mean, they wouldn't understand what they had. And you would want to say, Neanderthals, just, you know, don't break that thing. Just keep it. Someday it will really make sense to you. And I think that's true, because I know that I have something like 6% Neanderthal DNA, or probably, I think I have more than the average person. And, you know, and I don't have an iPhone. I have a Samsung. But, you know, it's kind of like that. We have just inherited this planet with all this diversity of life. And we are just beginning to understand it. And, you know, we ought to protect this stuff, because we don't know enough, and we don't, you know, let's hang on to it. We may need some of it. Okay, Norma.
Well, I am teaching conservation biology, and I do have an ethics flag on the class. So I just happened to have some thoughts. What Chris is talking about is sometimes called the rivet popper hypothesis. And I think it goes back to Paul Ehrlich, who said if you got on a plane and somebody was popping rivets out of that hold the plates onto the wings, planes will fly just fine if they lose some rivets. It's over-engineered. But at some point, some number of rivets, the plane falls out of the sky. And unless we're aeronautical engineers, we have absolutely no idea which rivets those are and how many. And so I think Chris is talking about that. We understand so little about how communities work and you know, what keeps this earth going. When we talk to people who are completely outside the conservation community, we often try to make arguments about potential drugs or potential ecosystem services, or all these sort of like, you don't like being out of doors, why would you care? You know, kind of stuff. Like Reagan said, when you've seen one sequoia, why would you want to see any more? But the truth is, most of the people who work on conservation, and I suspect most of the people here, the real driving motivations are either aesthetic values, meaning it's cool, it's interesting, it's beautiful, it's amazing. Just feel about nature the way people feel about great art and music. And ethical. And the range of ethical arguments, some are religious, some are not. but they come down to, oh, there's such a range, but the Judeo-Christian one is basically the earth is the Lord, and the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. It's not ours. We're obligated to take care of it. That's your sort of basic religious statement in the background that most of my students come from. But there's plenty of people I know who feel a very strong ethical demand to preserve the natural world and species, and they're absolutely flat out atheists. So it doesn't have to be religious. So, you know, economic, aesthetic, ethical, take your pick.
We have a number of rare species, you know, that we know were more abundant during the Pleistocene, and then it looks like they're on their way up. But, you know, think about climate changes as being cyclical events. And some of the rare plants, like another West Texas plant, the Hinkley oak, turns out, you know, pack rat midden data suggests that Hinkley oak was much more common 11,000 years ago. And then climate change, and now it's quite a rare species and probably is existing as root clones. But then if climates were to change again and the glaciers come back, then a lot of these rare species then become common again, and the ones that are common now, you know, migrate or become rare. So, you know, that's another argument for not getting rid of all the rare species.
Yeah, that's kind of rivet. Don't pop the rivets because you don't know the weather the plane's going to be flying through.
More rivets. It's a very riveting discussion we're having.
The next question, could you comment on the fact that there are other plant species in Big Bend that are very likely rarer than the 4 listed species, but don't seem to be getting much attention? I think this is the responsibility of the botanists in the park to be looking out for this. And that was one actually, I don't know if you remember, Chris, when I started and I called you and I said, how did Jackie know to monitor this fescue? Because you remember you were taking data on that plant for decades before it was listed. And it's like, which species should the park be keeping their eye on to get that data in order to make those conservation decisions? I think it's a big challenge of this job and the responsibilities of the park. And
as you perhaps talk to people who are not in the group, or think about putting something on iNaturalist or something like that, rare plants, there are people who will go, just like somebody wants the last snow leopard fur coat in the world as the species is driven to extinction. Rarity per se will attract collectors. For plants, most plants, it's not as bad as what butterfly collectors do, unless it's a cactus or an orchid. But exercise this discretion, and especially putting up location data. When we publish on these rare species, we work with the journals to degrade the location data to the point that, yes, there's a map and it shows approximately which quadrant of the county it's in, but not much more than that. And everybody responsible who publishes on endangered species does the same thing. And the journals are cool with it. So I would just want to give everybody the heads up, and especially cacti. There is such an international market, especially Japan and Germany, where there's the cachet of having a rare cactus species. Not everybody who wants a rare cactus species is sensitive to what they're doing to the population back in the wild. So I would just say discretion, discretion, discretion. So that's my soapbox for the evening.
Well said. And to add to that, so there is this part of the Endangered Species Act, which called critical habitat, where once we list a species, we're supposed to designate where the critical habitats are. Well, we never used to do that because formerly common sense played a role in our decisions. And 95% of Texas is privately owned. And so if we're going to learn about these species, we need a good relationship with landowners who won't fear letting us on their property, because even though critical habitat actually almost, it doesn't stop a landowner from doing anything. A lot of landowners don't like seeing a map being published in the Federal Register of their property with, plant habitats on it.